The wind howled down from the mountains, dragging with it sleet, snow, and the kind of cold that cut straight to the bone. It was the kind of night that made even the wolves keep to their dens, and the kind that made a man question his reason for living so far from town. Inside the single cabin that sat near the edge of the pines, Elias Warren sat hunched by the fire, the light flickering across his face. The logs popped and hissed, sending small sparks upward, and for a moment he simply watched them, his eyes half-lidded and distant. He had worked all day repairing the south fence, hands numbed from the wind, the ache of labor dull and constant. His supper, beans and hard bread, sat cooling on the table untouched. The knife in his hands moved slowly over a strip of leather, the edge of the blade scraping rhythmically, as he sharpened it more out of habit than need. There was no rush, nowhere to go, nothing pressing that couldn't wait till morning. The clock on the mantel ticked faintly. Its sound filled the gaps between the wind and the cracking fire. Beside it stood a faded photograph, the only fragile thing in a house built to survive storms. A woman's face caught in sunlight years ago smiled from behind the glass. Clara. His Clara. She had been gone 3 winters now, carried off by a fever that no doctor from town could cure. He had buried her on the ridge overlooking the creek they used to walk beside, and he'd told himself he'd keep going, one day at a time. But sometimes, like tonight, he wasn't so sure he still knew how. He leaned back, rubbed a hand across his stubbled jaw, and stared into the fire. Outside, the storm grew worse. Snow hissed against the windows and the pine trees groaned under its weight. Somewhere far off, a shutter banged loose. Elias didn't flinch. He'd lived through blizzards before. Still, the night had an edge to it, a feeling that prickled along the skin. He rose, moving stiffly to the window. Beyond the frosted glass, the world was white and shifting, an endless dance of snow and shadow. He pressed his palm to the cold pane, eyes narrowing. For a second, he thought he saw something, a darker shape moving between the trees, but it vanished almost as soon as he noticed it. He waited, listening, every muscle tight. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the forest, a soft, irregular thud. Then another, and another, weaker this time, as if something or someone were dragging itself through the snow. Elias reached for his lantern, the old brass one that had seen more nights than he cared to count. He lit it, the flame flaring to life, then pulled his heavy coat from its hook. The leather was cracked at the seams, the wool lining worn, but it kept the worst of the cold away. He shoved his hat low over his brow, opened the door, and stepped out. The cold hit him like a fist. The air burned in his lungs, his beard stiffened with frost in seconds, and snow clawed at his boots as he trudged through it. The light from his lantern cut a small path ahead of him, casting long shadows over the drifts. He listened, trying to catch that sound again. "Hello?" he called, his voice nearly swallowed by the wind. "Anybody out there?" Nothing. Only the relentless hiss of snow. He took a few more steps, scanning the edge of the woods. The trees swayed, black shapes against the white storm. He turned toward the barn, thinking maybe one of the horses had gotten loose. But then he saw it. A mound near the woodpile, small, still, half buried. Elias's stomach turned cold in a way the weather couldn't touch. He moved fast, boots crunching through the snow until he dropped to his knees beside it. The lantern's glow revealed a face pale and streaked with frost. A woman. She was young, no more than 20 maybe. Her hair dark and tangled, frozen in places to her skin. Her hands were curled close to her chest, her shawl stiff with ice. "Hey," Elias said roughly, shaking her shoulder. "Can you hear me?" A faint sound escaped her. Not quite a word, more like a sigh. Her lips were blue, her breathing shallow. "Don't you quit on me," he muttered, slipping an arm beneath her shoulders. "Not out here." He brushed the snow from her face to get a better look and stopped dead. For a long second, he couldn't breathe. Her eyes fluttered open, just for a moment, unfocused and glassy. And in that instant, the light of his lantern caught them. Gray eyes, clear and deep as a river under ice. The same eyes that had once looked at him from across a Sunday table. The same eyes he had kissed closed in a fevered sweat 3 years ago. "Clara," he whispered before he could stop himself. The girl's brow furrowed faintly, as though she'd heard him through some dream. Reason kicked back in. It wasn't her, couldn't be. The mind does cruel things when grief sits too long in the heart. Still, the sight of those eyes made something old and heavy stir inside him, a pain he thought time had dulled. "All right," he said under his breath, forcing his thoughts into order. No time for ghosts. He gathered her up in his arms. She was light, frighteningly so, and limp as wet cloth. Her head lolled against his shoulder as he stood. Snow whipped against them both, stinging his face as he trudged back toward the cabin. Each step sank deep, but he didn't stop, didn't slow. By the time he reached the porch, his hands were shaking from more than just the cold. He kicked the door open, the warmth from the fire rushing out to meet him. Inside, he laid her gently near the hearth, stripped away her frozen shawl and boots, and wrapped her in the thickest quilt he owned. He worked quickly, rubbing warmth back into her hands, checking her pulse, her breathing. She was alive, barely. Elias leaned back on his heels, breathing hard. The firelight danced over her face, softening the pallor, chasing away the frost. She looked so much like Clara it hurt to look at her. The shape of her cheek, the curve of her lips, even the small scar at her temple, it was all the same. "Who are you?" he whispered hoarsely. Her lips moved again, a faint whisper lost beneath the crackle of the fire. He leaned closer, straining to hear. "Please," she breathed. "Don't leave." "I won't," he said softly. "You're safe now." Her hand twitched beneath the blanket like she wanted to reach for him but couldn't. Then she went still again. Elias sat back, staring into the flames. His heart beat heavy and uneven, his mind spinning. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, it was strangely quiet, like the world had held its breath. He looked toward the photograph on the mantel, the one of Clara smiling with the sun on her hair, and then back at the stranger lying by his fire. It wasn't possible. But somehow he felt the same truth in his bones that he'd felt the night he met Clara for the first time. That his life had just shifted. That something larger than himself had stepped into his path. Morning came slow, like it had to fight its way through the storm. The light that filtered through the frost-covered window was thin and gray, touching everything in the cabin with the quiet of aftermath. Outside, the snow lay heavy over the land, soft, unbroken, except for the tracks Elias had left the night before. Inside, the fire had burned low, nothing left but a few glowing coals. Elias sat in his chair near the hearth, hat in his lap, the lines under his eyes deeper than they'd been in years. He hadn't slept. Not really. Each time he tried, he heard the shallow rasp of the woman's breathing, afraid it might stop if he closed his eyes too long. She lay on the cot he'd pulled close to the fire, wrapped in layers of wool and old quilts, her hair still damp from where he'd melted snow to wash her face clean. The color had crept back into her cheeks, faint but real, and that small miracle had kept him anchored through the long night. When she stirred, it was small, a twitch of her fingers, a soft sound deep in her throat. Elias leaned forward, his heart jumping like a gunshot. "Easy now," he said, his voice low but steady. Her eyes fluttered open. The same gray, that same impossible shade he thought he'd only ever see again in dreams. She blinked at the light, her pupils adjusting, her lips parting as she tried to speak. "You're safe," Elias added quickly, setting his hat aside. "You're in my cabin. Found you out there last night, half frozen." Her brow furrowed, confusion clouding her face. She glanced around, taking in the room. The log walls, the stacked firewood, the tools by the door. Then her gaze returned to him. She didn't shrink back or flinch. Instead, she just studied him, cautious, searching. Her voice cracked. "I don't remember getting here." "You were near the woodpile," he said. "Storm near buried you. Lucky I heard." Her throat worked as she swallowed. I was running." Elias nodded, waiting. From them. He didn't press, though every instinct told him there was more. Her hands trembled as she pushed herself up a little, the quilt slipping down to reveal bandages he'd wrapped around her arms, places where the cold had bitten deep. "You shouldn't move too much," he warned gently. "I have to," she murmured, looking past him toward the window. "They'll come. They always—" Her words broke off, replaced by a quick gasp of pain. Elias reached forward to steady her, but stopped just short of touching. She stared down at his hand, those same rough, scarred hands that had buried his wife and built this place from nothing, and her eyes so fly.